9. Beelitz-Heilstätten Hospital. Nestled deep in the forest, roughly 30 miles southwest of Berlin, a crumbling Nazi hospital quietly gives up its secrets to modern-day visitors from the outside world. Known as Beelitz-Heilstätten, the enormous 60-building complex was originally built as a tuberculosis sanatorium. When it first opened in 1898, it was the world's largest treatment center for tuberculosis and other lung diseases. During World War I, Beelitz-Heilstätten functioned as a field hospital. In fact, Adolf Hitler was admitted there in 1916 for a leg wound he incurred at the Battle of Somme. The complex operated as a field hospital again during World War II, primarily for wounded Nazi soldiers serving under Hitler. After the conflict ended in 1945, the Soviet Red Army took over the property. The site remained under Russian control for nearly 50 years until 1994, when the last of the Red Army forces cleared out following the Soviet Union's collapse. Today, parts of the complex remain in use, but the vast majority of it is in disrepair and has primarily become an attraction for urban explorers. The property is also occasionally used as a movie set. 8. The Devil's Casino. According to legend, there's a place in northwestern Mexico called El Casino del Diablo, or the Devil's Casino. It all started on New Year's Eve in 1950 in the town of Hermosillo, where a beautiful young woman named Linda got doled up for a big dance at the local golf club and casino. The club consisted of a restaurant, bar, and space for couples and singles to meet and mingle. It was especially popular among young men and women seeking their ideal suitor. On the night of the dance, she got more dressed up than she ever had before in her life. But her mother was angry at her for making plans to go out without telling her, much less on a holiday. Linda spent the evening crying in her bedroom before making the decision to go to the dance regardless of how her mother felt. As soon as she entered the casino, all eyes were upon her. Multiple men asked Linda to dance, but she turned them all down because she didn't think they were good enough for her. Eventually, a strikingly attractive gentleman entered the casino, and Linda agreed to dance with him. After dancing for a while, Linda began to feel unbearably hot, and she noticed the smell of sulfur. She looked down and realized she had a chicken's leg and a goat's leg. She screamed and fainted. Meanwhile, everyone in the casino fled as the building rapidly caught fire. The club was left in ruins, and nobody knows what became of the beautiful young woman who attended the dance without her mother's permission. 7. The Churchill Tunnel. Beneath Jefferson Park in Richmond, Virginia, there's a 4,000-foot-long sealed-off void known as the Churchill Tunnel. It was built in 1873 and was already considered obsolete by the time it was abandoned in 1902. The city of Richmond tried to reclaim the tunnel in 1925, but the project failed when a nearly 200-foot section collapsed as a 10-car train passed through. At least 2 workers were killed by the cave-in, and only one managed to escape and survived. Legend holds that the workers who were killed reawakened an ancient vampire who lived inside the tunnel. According to the story, the vampire caused the collapse as revenge against the workers for disrupting his peaceful slumber. He was reportedly seen crouching over one of the victims and baring his bloody, jagged teeth before fleeing the scene. Several attempts have been made over the years to recover the bodies and the buried locomotive, but the city stopped trying due to repeated collapses, sinkholes, and other problems. The tunnel was permanently sealed off with sand and concrete in 1926 and remains so today. Throughout the tunnel's lifespan, at least 9 people lost their lives to similar circumstances as the 2 men who were supposedly victimized by the vampire. This is because the tunnel was built among clay and soft sandstone and was therefore not structurally sound. 6. Texas Zombie Town. During the early 2000s, a 28-acre gated subdivision called Tundra Village was built outside San Antonio, Texas, with the intention of housing employees from a nearby Toyota plant. Plans unexpectedly changed in 2008 when the developer, Mauro T. Padilla, was charged and then convicted of fraud for cutting corners to save on construction costs and using investor funds for personal expenses. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and construction on Tundra Village ground to a screeching halt. For more than a decade, the sprawling collection of 37 buildings sat abandoned in South Bexar County. Nothing truly terrifying has ever happened there. After all, nobody even got the chance to move in. Yet it looked like a scene straight out of a zombie apocalypse film. The project ended before the construction crews could get around to paving an actual road or any driveways, leaving behind an overgrown dirt path that ran through the development. Foliage blocked the graffiti-covered garages and front porches of the homes that were never lived in. Had the development come to fruition, each unit would have 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a 2-car garage. It may sound to you like a lot of perfectly good housing went to waste, and you're not the only person who feels that way. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to make the empty houses livable and put them up for sale. As of 2018, the homes hadn't been maintained in over a decade and had become more of an eyesore than anything, standing out to passing highway motorists like a sore thumb. Even in their sad state, however, the houses looked like they still had hope of being turned into homes. Things finally took a positive turn in 2018, when work on the project resumed under new ownership. As of 2020, several of the homes were almost finished and ready for sale. The development has been renamed the Palo Alto Villas. Would you spend a night in this abandoned subdivision? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Cincinnati Subway. Beneath the streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, there's a 3-mile network of dark, empty tunnels and 4 abandoned subway stations that were never used. They were built as part of the Cincinnati Subway Project, which began in the early 20th century as a solution to the rapidly increasing congestion of the city's downtown area. It was one of the earliest attempts to establish a subway system in the United States. But the project unfortunately proved problematic. Its costs rose to the point where it became unaffordable. The subway was cancelled indefinitely in 1928, when it was just 1/3 complete. It was meant to be a temporary closure, but with the Great Depression right around the corner, the city's priorities would soon change and construction never resumed. By the time the city officially cancelled the project in 1948, America had largely become a nation of cars, making the concept of a subway system obsolete in most cities. The Cincinnati subway's eerie remnants remain as a testament to what Andrew J. Hawkins described in The Verge as one of the biggest transportation blunders of all time. It's the country's largest unused, unfinished subway system. City officials have made it almost impossible for civilians to visit the tunnels and stations by going out of their way to demolish entrances and conceal signs of its existence. The system's most visible remnant exists in the form of the neglected and decaying Union Terminal Station. Anyone who wants to access the tunnels must know where to go and be willing to trespass. Author and photographer Jake Mecklenburg is one of the few people who's seen the Cincinnati subway for themselves, and he documented the creepy sight for the rest of us to enjoy through his photos in hopes of keeping its history alive. The city currently has no plans to repurpose the empty space, and it seems like authorities would much prefer to forget that the failed transit system is even there. 4. Bhangarh Fort. In Rajasthan, India's Alwar district, there's an ancient fort dating back to 1573 BC. Known as Bhangarh Fort, it was built by local ruler Raja Bhagwan Singh as a gift for his son Madho Singh. During its heyday, it stood as an architectural marvel in a thriving town of more than 10,000 residents. Today, the fort sits in ruins, and it's considered one of India's most haunted sites. It consists of multiple decaying structures, including temples, public chambers, marketplaces, mansions, also known as havelis, and a royal palace. There are numerous myths surrounding the abandonment of Bhangarh Fort. According to one version, the property was cursed by an old ascetic, a person who practices a highly self-disciplined and deprived lifestyle as a religion, because he disapproved of how the fort's tall structures overshadowed the surrounding buildings. This was apparently a strictly off-limits practice at the time. Another story claims that a black magician cursed the fort after attempting and failing to win the love of a local princess. There are other legends surrounding Bhangarh Fort, including several newer tales of fatal accidents occurring at the site. The property is currently run by the Archaeological Survey of India and is open to visitors, who are strictly banned from entering between sunset and sunrise, with the exception of occasional nighttime tours that are offered through the agency. 3. Stasi Spy Station. Better known as the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security was East Germany's secret police force during the 40 years that the country was divided during the Cold War. From 1950 to 1990, much of the civilian population lived in a heightened state of paranoia. People dealt with the constant fear that they were under surveillance, or that their co-workers, friends, neighbors, and even family members would sell them out to the state for saying anything that could be interpreted as going against the communist leadership. Much of the spying that went on was unofficial. By 1990, the Stasi had as many as 189,000 civilian informants. But there were also tens of thousands of official staff members, and they needed places to conduct their work. The perfect intelligence gathering opportunity landed right in the Stasi's lap in 1985, when West Germany requested permission to lay a communications cable through the East German part of Berlin. Not only did the Stasi tap the cable immediately, they built a spy station over part of it. They were able to do so because West Berlin was smack dab in the middle of East German territory. The only way for people or cables to get to or from the West was by passing through East Germany, also known as the DDR, thereby creating the perfect conditions for spying. To extend the reach of their listening abilities, the Stasi built a tower equipped with antennae and other receivers that were capable of picking up signals from West Berlin and elsewhere in West Germany. Located in Rhino, what's left of the station is still on the property and accessible to visitors. 2. Church of Bones. The Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini, or Our Lady of the Conception of the Capuchins, looks like an ordinary church at first glance. But it's an entirely different story beneath the building, where there's a labyrinth of crypts with the skeletal remains of more than 4,000 friars covering the walls and ceilings. Some of the bones are arranged into patterns that are thought to have some sort of religious significance, while other skeletons are dressed in traditional Franciscan attire. The church was commissioned in 1626 by Pope Urban VIII and was completed in 1631. That same year, a member of the Capuchin order named Cardinal Antonio Barberini ordered for the remains of thousands of friars to be exhumed from their original resting places and relocated in the church's crypt. Experts have dated the bones to a nearly 400-year period, from 1500 to 1870. There are 5 chapels in the crypt, and they rely exclusively on a very limited supply of natural light, effectively adding to the site's eeriness. Several noteworthy historical figures have visited, including the Marquis de Sade and Mark Twain. It's also said that the crypt inspired other famous skeleton-covered sites throughout the world, including the Sedlec Ossuary in the Czech Republic and the Skull Chapel in Poland. 1. The Belmont Tunnel. As a prairie state, Nebraska is almost entirely flat, with no mountains and few hills. Consequently, it only has one rail tunnel, and most of its residents reportedly don't even know about it. Known as the Belmont Tunnel, the dark 750-foot passageway is located in Dawes County near the ghost town of Belmont. Construction on the tunnel began in 1888, and it was used regularly from 1889 to 1992 when a bypass was built. At the peak of the tunnel's use, the nearby town of Belmont consisted of as many as 28 buildings, including a rail depot, a pool hall, 2 stores, a saloon, a grain elevator, and a lumber yard. The town's population peaked in 1950 at 60 residents. Belmont was never very big, but it declined majorly following the construction of the rail bypass, and it eventually ceased to exist. Today, it's a ghost town, consisting of 2 abandoned houses and a deserted school, which officially closed in 2009. Although it's no longer in use, the tunnel continues to attract curious visitors. but it's not something people would ever notice while simply passing through. It's located along a rough dirt road, where drivers are cautioned not to drive more than 35 miles per hour due to the risk of fishtailing.
5. SS Kamloops. In 1924, the SS Kamloops was launched as a lake freighter. It was built by the Furnace Shipbuilding Company for the Canada Steamship Lines. The 250-foot, or 76 meters, vessel completed its sea testing on July 5, 1924, and her main duty was meant to carry manufactured goods from Montreal, Canada, over to Thunder Bay, Ontario. In the 1920s, Canada was actually still a part of the British Empire, so the Prairie Provinces brought most of their goods from England. And at the time, the country's freshwater fleet, which included the Kamloops among many others, was a vital link in this vein of imperial commerce. In late November 1927, Kamloops was dispatched to the Great Lakes, carrying a mixed cargo of paper-making machinery, tar paper, piping, coiled wire, food, and shoes. And after a short stop in Courtright, Ontario to top off its cargo with salt, Kamloops continued up to Lake Huron. On December 4th, the ship passed through Sault Ste. Marie Canal before facing the challenge of traversing Lake Superior. But sadly, the ship never finished this task. Like many other vessels assigned to do Lake Superior runs, Kamloops ran into a massive storm on December 5th. And after being heavily coated with freezing ice, the freighter was last seen heading toward the southeastern shore of Isle Royale the next day. But sadly, Kamloops and her crew of 22 were never seen alive again. A search for the vessel started just 6 days later on December 12, 1927, concentrating on the Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. For about 10 days, the search continued, but Kamloops was never found. And it wasn't until the next season in April 1928 that another attempt was made to find the ship and its crew members. Then, in May of that year, a fisherman made a shocking discovery on Isle Royale. The bodies of several crew members were found, and wreckage from the ship suddenly washed ashore. And in June, even more bodies were located. After that, a more comprehensive search for the Kamloops was carried out, but nothing more was ever found. Of the 9 bodies recovered, only 5 were accurately identified, and their remains were shipped to surviving family members. The other 4 unidentified bodies were buried at Thunder Bay, and a memorial stone was placed over their graves back in 2011. A glimpse into the final moments of the crew was revealed in December 1928, when a message in a bottle was discovered by a trapper. The note was written by a young female assistant stewardess named Alice Bettridge. She'd initially survived the ship sinking, but didn't last long. And with the little strength she had left, she decided to write a message to her parents that said, "I am the last one left alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." For 50 years, Kamloops was remembered as one of the ghost ships of the Great Lakes. But on August 21, 1977, the wreck was located northwest of Isle Royale by a group of divers. It's since been confirmed that there are still human remains on the ship, including the body of a crew member that's lodged under a stairway in the engine room. This crew member holds some significance and is now nicknamed Old Whitey. It's been said that a ghost inhabits this shockingly well-preserved corpse, and according to several people who've been to visit the shipwreck, he watches the divers as they explore the sunken vessel. On several occasions, Old Whitey has even followed the explorers around and has reached out to try and touch them. But apparently this ghost is just lonely and has never really tried to harm anyone. And while this may seem hard to believe, there's been so many accounts of this happening that it's hard to fully deny. 4. The Ghosts of Alkimos. The Alkimos, or the Vigo Hanstein, was built in Maryland back in 1943 as part of the U.S. military's Liberty ship program in World War II. Shortly after being completed, the vessel was sold off to the Norwegian merchant fleet, which was under the command of Captain Torbjorn Thorsen at the time. This crew was mostly Canadian and Norwegian sailors, and the Alkimos transported ammunition and other materials that were needed to manufacture weapons. But toward the tail end of the global conflict, the ship also transported both German and U.S. prisoners of war. When World War II was finally over, the Alkimos was sold once again. But in 1952, it ran aground in New Zealand, prompting the ship's owner to pawn it off to a Greek shipping company. This company actually gave the vessel its final name, the Alkimos, which is Greek for strong. Then, 11 years later, the ship hit a reef near the coast of Western Australia and had to be towed to Fremantle, where it underwent repairs. After being repaired, the vessel was again transported to Hong Kong so that new parts could be added onto it. But before it reached its destination, the Alkimos broke free of its tow line and got stuck in shallow water. The ship was badly damaged, but attempts were made to try and salvage it. These efforts were later strangely abandoned after a series of unexplained events, and a fire broke out on board. Maud E. Steen was a radio operator from Canada on the ship in 1944. When World War II broke out, Canada became involved in the conflict, but didn't let women fight in the army, which was the case for most nations at the time. The Norwegian merchant fleet was the only Allied fleet that let women serve, and for this reason, many signed up to help, including Maud E. Steen. Steen served as a radio operator on the vessel for about 6 or so months. At the time, the ship was being used to transport gliders to Naples. And one day, when the Vigo Hanstein was unloading, Steen was shot dead by another crew member. Afterward, the person responsible ended their own life. The incident was so horrific that the military claimed that Steen had been killed by enemy fire instead of revealing the truth. She was then named as the first Toronto woman to be killed while in service. Soon after the tragedy, legends started to pop up that a group of welders had accidentally been sealed inside the walls of the ship while it was being built. Despite their attempts to be heard, they weren't discovered until the next morning, after they'd all already suffocated to death. After that, the vessel's Norwegian crew claimed to experience several supernatural phenomena, like lights flickering on and off, the engine malfunctioning, mysterious cold spots despite warm weather, and the radio emitting an eerie static. The ship is also said to be cursed by Maud E. Stein's spirit, and many people blame the strange phenomena and bad luck the vessel has experienced on the woman's restless ghost. In 1963, paranormal activity forced a team of salvage workers to leave the ship. The final event that prompted the hasty evacuation was when a bizarre fire broke out. To this day, the cause of the fire has never been accurately identified. Divers have also gone missing while exploring the wreck, so people are often advised to stay clear of the area. Do you think Maud is haunting the ship? Would you be brave enough to visit the wreck and find out for yourself? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the video so far. 3. SS Emperor. The steel-hulled Canadian lake freighter called the SS Emperor was built between 1910 and 1911 by the Collingwood Shipbuilding Company. The ship was sold to the Canada Steamship Lines not long after entering service and was used to carry a variety of cargoes, but most frequently it carried iron ore to Point Edward, Ontario. On June 3, 1947, the ship was headed to Ontario after unloading some coal in Fort William. Upon their arrival, 10,429 tons, or 9,461.0297 metric tons, of iron ore were loaded onto the vessel. From there, the Emperor set sail for Ashtabula, Ohio. The visibility that night was good, and the weather was clear when they left. But when Captain Eldon Walkinshaw handed over watch duties to the vessel's first mate, James A. Morey, things went horribly wrong. Right before 4:15 a.m. on June 4th, the ship ran aground on Isle Royale. And less than an hour later, it sank beneath the waves. As a result, 12 crew members died, but the 21 survivors were later rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard. The Emperor now sits in 31 feet, or 9.4 meters, of water in Lake Superior. And while the circumstances surrounding the sinking aren't all that mysterious, there have been some bizarre sightings at the wreck site. One diver claimed to see the apparition of a sailor laying on his bunk. Apparently, the ghost looked over at the diver with a blank expression, prompting him to quickly go back up to the surface. On other occasions, divers reported hearing strange engine sounds despite the boilers being underwater for decades. One man even claimed to have heard a metallic voice say, "Die," not once, but twice while exploring through the wreck. Another poor diver even came face to face with the ghost of an engine crew member. Upon making eye contact with the apparition, whose eyes were described simply as dark pools of nothing, the ghost went about checking the ship's equipment inside the engine room. but it seemed to be unaware of the thick layer of muck that had accumulated on the interior of the vessel, brought in by the lake it came to rest in. Needless to say, the SS Emperor is known as one of the most haunted shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, possibly the country. So if you choose to explore this sunken vessel, beware of the spirits that haunt the insides of its waterlogged walls. 2. The Ghost of Martha. One of the wrecks in Lake Ontario is the St. Peter, a lake schooner that was loaded with coal when it sank during a storm back in October 1898. All 3 people on board when it capsized, which included the captain's wife, lost their lives. The only survivor was Captain John Griffin. The ship is very well preserved and intact, and every year, tourists try to make the challenging dive to visit the vessel's watery grave. But in late fall, scuba divers reported bizarre happenings in the shipwreck's vicinity. This is the same time of year that St. Peter met its tragic fate, which explains why these incidents only happen in the fall. The captain's wife that passed away in the sinking of the ship is known to residents living near the site as Martha. According to them, she makes an appearance to divers when danger surrounds the nearby lake. In October, water sometimes surges in a peculiar way around the harbor at Hughes Marina, a location where divers launch their boats. The strange flow resembles a tide, and the divers attribute this phenomenon to Martha herself. They say she pushes the water to draw boats back into the harbor where they'll be safe. Some people think she's trying to keep divers and sailors off the deadly lake where she lost her life so many years ago. She even appears in human form from time to time, but again, usually only during the late fall. And apparently, ever since the anchor from St. Peter was brought ashore and hung under an oak tree at Hughes Marina, she started making appearances on dry land too. If you ever visit, you might be able to see her. 1. The haunted RMS Rhone. At the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, near Salt Island in the British Virgin Islands, lies the RMS Rhone. At 30 feet, 9.1 meters long, and 40 feet, 12.2 meters wide, the Rhone was once considered the fastest and most advanced vessel in the English Royal Mail Packet Company's fleet. She served as a passenger and mail carrier back in 1865. But nowadays, divers who explore her wreckage claim that they feel the presence of those who lost their lives when the vessel sank. The ship apparently came into contact with a Category 5 hurricane on October 29, 1867. After making multiple trips from England to the Caribbean, tragedy hit the RMS Rhone. Before embarking on their final journey, Robert Woolley, the ship's captain, didn't seem worried that the ship would run into a storm, since it was well past hurricane season. But this nonchalant attitude ultimately led the Rhone and all of its crew to their watery graves. As the ship passed by the island of Tortola, Captain Woolley mistakenly thought they were heading into a simple early winter storm. But when the skies suddenly turned gray and the storm became increasingly treacherous, the captain laid anchor to stay in the correct position. A sigh of relief washed over the ship's crew when the storm suddenly cleared up and the blue sky once again became visible. But at that moment, Captain Woolley realized his fatal mistake. They weren't actually safe at all, but instead they were in the eye of a hurricane. As the Rhone tried to escape and make it back to the open seas, a massive wave hit the vessel as it sailed between Dead Chest Cay and Salt Island. As a result, the ship became stuck in a rocky outcrop known as Black Rock. The Rhone smashed against these rocks, causing seawater to fill up the boiler room. This led to an explosion that ultimately ripped the vessel right in two. It's said that somewhere between 300 and 500 people were on board when the ship sank, but only 23 survived. Over the years, divers have come forward to claim that the wreck is actually haunted. There have been accounts of people having their shoulders tugged on, and others have even reported hearing screams and groans coming from the wreck. Given the horrific way these people lost their lives, it's not hard to believe that some of them have stayed trapped in the sunken vessel, forced to relive their most traumatic experience for eternity.
8. Soviet submarine. The K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, the first nuclear-powered submarine in the Soviet Navy's lineup, was moved to the Museum of Naval Glory in Kronstadt, a base near St. Petersburg, Russia, back in October 2022. The sub was officially part of Project 627, or the November class, and was designed to destroy enemy aircraft carriers. The K3 first made history in 1962 when it became the first sub to reach the North Pole under ice. The K3 also has a tragic history. In 1961, it caught on fire and had an explosion that killed 39 crew members. The sub was also contaminated with radiation. Then, in 1985, it collided with a U.S. Navy submarine in the Barents Sea, causing severe damage to both vessels. In 1989, it was finally decommissioned and laid up at a naval yard in Severodvinsk. In 2022, after decades of neglect, the K3 was restored and moved to Kronstadt. The submarine was towed along the White Sea-Baltic Canal and the Neva River, passing through several bridges. The journey took 2 weeks and attracted massive public attention. The K3 is now a permanent exhibit at the Museum of Naval Glory, which showcases the rich history and many achievements of the Russian Navy. The museum also features other historic ships, like the cruiser Aurora and the icebreaker Krasin. The K3 sub is a symbol of Soviet naval prowess and a reminder of the not-so-distant Cold War era. Number 7. Taliban's U.S. vehicles. One of the consequences that came after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021 was that the Taliban took control of thousands of U.S. military vehicles that were left behind. The vehicles included armored carriers, mine-resistant cars, Humvees, Scan Eagle drones, and more. The Taliban captured these vehicles from military bases, airports, and checkpoints that they overran as they quickly took control of the country. Some of the vehicles were abandoned by Afghan soldiers, while others were surrendered or taken by force. The Taliban used these vehicles to showcase their victory and to bolster their fighting capabilities against resistance members. They also moved some of the vehicles to the Iranian border, where they had a skirmish with border guards over the access to the Helmand River back in May of 2023. The U.S. government tried to stop the Taliban from using these cars by disabling some of them before leaving Afghanistan, but these efforts were not enough to prevent the Taliban from getting their hands on the large and diverse fleet that was initially paid for by American taxpayers. The seizure of these vehicles raised concerns about the security implications for the region and the rest of the world. The cars could be used by the Taliban to oppress the native Afghan people, attacking neighboring countries, or be sold to other militant groups. The vehicles could also reveal sensitive information or technology that was once exclusive to the US to the Taliban. Number 6. Tanks shifted to stop Russia. In 2014, the U.S. Army had to move hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles from Germany to Eastern Europe thanks to a NATO initiative set in place to deter Russian aggression. The vehicles were transported by rail, road, and sea across multiple countries. The relocation was a response after Russia's annexation of Crimea and its support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, which set off alarms for NATO allies in the region. So, the US and NATO wanted to calm their partners and demonstrate their commitment to defense. The vehicles belonged to the US Army's 1st Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division. They were part of the European Activity Set, or EAS, a pre-positioned stockpile of equipment that can be quickly deployed for training or other operations. The vehicles included 29 M1A2 Abrams tanks, 33 M2A3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 16 M109A6 Paladin self-propelled howitzers, and 18 M99 2A2 field artillery ammunition support vehicles. There were also trucks, trailers, generators, and more. They arrived by ship in the northern port of Bremerhaven, Germany on January 6, 2014, before being loaded onto trains and moved to locations in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, and Bulgaria. The vehicles were used by about 4,000 U.S. troops who participated in exercises and training with NATO's allies. The relocation was part of Operation Atlantic Resolve, a series of ongoing efforts by the U.S. and NATO to enhance security and stability across the whole of Europe. The operation also involves rotational deployments of U.S. forces, joint exercises, infrastructure improvements, as well as information sharing. Number 5. Guard technicians restore vehicles. In order to truly showcase the story of the Guard, New York National Guard maintenance specialists helped with the renovation of vintage cars back in 2013. The vehicles included an M4A3 Sherman tank, an M8 Greyhound armored car, and even an M3A1 half-track. They were moved from different locations to the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs. The relocation of the vehicles was a challenging task since they were old and fragile. The technicians had to use cranes, forklifts, trailers, and even a few flatbed trucks to move the vehicles safely. They also had to coordinate with local authorities and police teams to ensure smooth traffic while doing so. The renovation of the vehicles was a whole different ballgame, full of labor-intensive and meticulous processes, as they had to be cleaned, repaired, painted, and restored to their original glory. The technicians used their skills to fix the mechanical and electrical problems, replace the missing or damaged parts, and apply the correct markings. They also researched the history and specifications of each car to ensure both accuracy and authenticity. The vehicles were part of the museum's collection of over 10,000 artifacts that illustrate the history and role the New York National Guard played from the colonial era to the modern day. The museum also features multiple exhibits, displays, and programs that educate the public about the Guard's contributions to the country. The relocation and renovation of the historic cars were a way of preserving and continuing the legacy of the New York National Guard and its members. The vehicles were not only symbols of military power and technology, but also a reminder of courage and sacrifice. They remain a source of pride and inspiration for the current and future generations of Guardsmen. What do you think about the Guard? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed the video so far. Number 4. From Reefs to Museums. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a history-defining surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. Among the weapons used by the Japanese were 5 mini-subs, each carrying 2 crew members and 2 torpedoes. Their goal was to infiltrate the harbor and target the U.S. Navy battleships. But none of the mini-subs succeeded. 4 of them were either sunk or destroyed by enemy forces, and one of them, HA-19, was stranded on a reef way outside the harbor. The submarine was eventually spotted by a U.S. patrol plane and attacked. The crew tried to purposefully sink the sub, but only one of them managed to escape. The other, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured after he washed ashore. He became the first Japanese prisoner of war. The U.S. Navy salvaged the submarine and studied its design thoroughly. They also used it as a propaganda tool to boost morale among Americans. The sub was toured around the country to promote the sale of war bonds, which were used to finance the war. It was showcased in various cities, attracting crowds of curious onlookers who wanted to see the weapon. In 1943, it was donated to the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, where it has remained to this day. The museum is now part of the National Museum of the Pacific War, which honors the legacy of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who commanded the U.S. Pacific Fleet in World War II. The sub is mounted on a wall inside the museum where visitors can see its sleek black hull, conning tower, and torpedoes intact. It is a fascinating artifact that tells a story of courage, failure, and fate. Number 3. Soviet submarines' final voyage. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy sent out a fleet of diesel-electric submarines to spy on U.S. and NATO warships. One of these submarines was B39, a Foxtrot-class sub commissioned in 1967. It served for over 20 years. B39 was one of the largest non-nuclear submarines ever built and carried up to 24 torpedoes, some of which could deliver nuclear warheads. B-39 was assigned to the Soviet Pacific Fleet and patrolled through the North Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Arctic Ocean. In 1989, B-39 had a close encounter with a U.S. Navy frigate in the middle of the Sea of Japan, where both crews took photos of each other. B-39 was later decommissioned in 1994 and sold off to Finland. From there, it changed hands several times and somehow ended up in Seattle, Washington in 2002. In 2005, it was purchased by the Maritime Museum of San Diego, California, where it became both an exhibit and an interactive attraction. The museum installed a video, light, and sound production inside the sub called To the Brink of War, which simulated a nuclear crisis scenario. The exhibit aimed to educate visitors about the history of the Cold War. But the submarine also faced many challenges and risks. It was seized by the Romanian authorities thanks to unpaid debts and taxes and had to be released after years of legal battles. It also suffered from corrosion due to saltwater exposure and weather. It required constant maintenance and repairs, which were expensive, and in 2021 the museum decided to withdraw the sub from its collection and scrap it altogether, citing public safety reasons and lack of funds. The fate of B39 reflects the changing times and circumstances that affect both military equipment and human lives. Number 2. Arctic nuclear subs lifted. In 2020, Russia successfully completed a major operation to lift 2 Soviet nuclear submarines and 4 reactor compartments up and out of the Arctic Ocean, reducing the amount of radioactive material in the area's water by 90%. The project was part of Russia's efforts to clean up its nuclear past and protect the environment from contamination. The 2 nuclear subs, K-27 and K-159, were among the 6 that sank in the Arctic waters between 1965 and 2003. They held about 1 million curies of radiation. The submarines posed a serious threat to the marine ecosystem as well as human health, since they could leak radioactive substances into the ocean. The operation to lift the submarines was taken on by a special vessel called Mikhail Rudnitsky, which was equipped with a crane. The vessel had to overcome harsh weather conditions, strong currents, and thick ice to reach the sunken subs, which were at a depth of 33 and 248 meters, between 108 feet and 814 feet. The vessel also had to deal with risks of explosion, because the submarines had torpedoes and missiles on board. The lifting process involved attaching cables and slings to the subs and slowly raising them to the surface. They were then placed on a floating dock and towed to a shipyard. The reactor compartments were cut off from the hulls and sealed away inside special containers. They will be stored at a secure site until they can be properly disposed of safely. The operation was a historic achievement by Russian officials and international experts. It was part of a larger program called LEPSI, whose goal is to remove all radioactive waste from the Arctic by 2030. The program is supported by the European Union, Norway, and other countries. Russia hopes that by cleaning up its tainted nuclear legacy, it will improve its image with other Arctic nations. And at number 1, tanks relocated from Syria. In 2018, Israel moved dozens of tanks and armored personnel carriers from its border with Syria to its border with Gaza during escalating tensions with Hamas. The move was viewed as a sign of Israel's readiness to respond to attacks from Gaza. The tanks were part of the 188th Armored Brigade, or the Barak Brigade, which deployed in the Golan Heights in 2014. The brigade was equipped with Merkava Mark IV tanks, which are considered among the most advanced and protected tanks on Earth. They have a 120mm smoothbore gun, a 60mm mortar, and a remote-controlled machine gun. They also have an active protection system called Trophy, which can intercept and destroy incoming missiles if necessary. The armored personnel carriers were M113s, which are used to transport infantry and also provide fire support. The M113s have a 12.7mm machine gun and can carry 11 soldiers. They're armored against small fire and shrapnel, but are vulnerable to anti-tank weapons as well as mines. The relocation of the tanks and armored personnel carriers was a response to the Hamas and other militant groups that have been launching rockets, incendiary balloons, and explosive devices at Israel. It is necessary to note that Israel had also been conducting airstrikes and artillery strikes against Hamas targets in Gaza during this time. The relocation was intended to reinforce Israel's deterrence and send a message to Hamas that their country would not tolerate any further aggression. The relocation was also a reflection of the changing security in Syria, where the civil war had been winding down and the threat from Iran and Hezbollah had been significantly reduced. Israel was concerned about the presence of Iranian forces and proxies near its border and carried out several strikes against them. But after a Russian plane was accidentally shot down by Syrian air defenses in September of 2018, Russia deployed advanced S-300 anti-aircraft systems to Syria, which limited Israel's freedom in the airspace. The relocation of the tanks and armored carriers was a strategic decision that showed Israel's ability to adapt to different threats. It also demonstrated the country's commitment to defend its sovereignty and security from any and all enemies. We hope you enjoyed learning about these amazing and risky operations. These are just a few of the stories that show how much effort and courage it takes to deal with the consequences of war. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. And let us know in the comments what you think about these stories, or if you have any suggestions for future topics. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.